on injuries and economic burden. It is seen as from casualties to costs, examining the economic impact of injuries. To chair this session, I would like to cordially invite Professor Amalari Silva, Professor in Economics, Department of Economics, Faculty of Arts, University of Colombo, and Professor William D. Silva, Professor in Community Dentistry, Department of Community Dental Health, Faculty of Dental Sciences, University of Kerala. Over to you, Samuel.
Thank you very much for asking us to chair this session. It is very interesting and important that you have chosen to focus on economic burden of road traffic accidents. Work that has been done in relation to alcohol and tobacco in relation to the cost of road traffic accidents shows that the amount of spend is very large, as reflected also in the case of the damage involved. A number of statistics are provided for the deaths that occur due to road traffic accidents, but alongside that, there is a large amount of money being spent in terms of morbidity, both in treating patients and in the burden that it poses on the families due to the loss of earnings that happen when people get hurt due to road traffic accidents. So this is a very important topic that you have chosen to focus on, and to start off the session, we invite Dr. William D. Silva to introduce the first speaker.
Good morning. Thank you, my co-chair. The first session has three speakers, namely Dr. Sarat Samagri, Dr. A. Mehta from India, and now Dr. Professor Samarth Anuradhana. And first speaker will be physically here, and the two other speakers will join online. So with that, may I introduce Dr. Sarat Samagri.
Hello.
Medical audience in introduction.
Hello.
He's a consultant of physician.
Oh.
Serving as the senior
මම දැන් මේ හෝටල් මේක ඉන්නේ අර මේ ප්‍රෝග්‍රෑම් එක. ඕකේ. නෑ මට WhatsApp ලින්ක් එකක් දැම්මම ඇති. හරි එහෙනම් හරි මම එවන්නම් මේ ප්‍රෝග්‍රෑම් එකෙන් පස්සේ එවන්නම්. Right. Okay, right.
Thank you very much. Yes, distinguished resource persons, the arts persons. I would have preferred to talk after the context that I will present anyway. I'll be touching on the policy and the resource allocation. It is an important area that we are marching forward, and the non-deliberation of the law of ceremony was highlighted, especially by the minister also here. And I will be discussing about the role of policymakers in addressing economic burden of injuries and respecting resources for prevention and intervention and rehabilitation. As for prevention, this morning, injury is the leading cause of mortality the risk factors for injury and in proposing interventions to tackle those risks. So, in my presentation, I will be covering about what public policies, the importance of that, the evidence for decision making, policy process and the role of policymakers, which I am discuss, and more importantly, the prioritization and the resource allocation by these policymakers, and then most importantly, I will end up with the important emphasis on effective interaction and communication with the policymaker. That is where I see a vacuum which needs to be built, a lot of evidence and research work is necessary done. So, public policies are the general principles by which government is guided in its management of public affairs. Policy making broadly refers to the process used by the government to decide what to do or what not to do about a public problem or issue. In this case, the economic burden of injuries that requires its attention and action. Therefore, policy development plays an important role in the prevention. The Institute of Medicine defined the process, the policy development and the process by which society makes decisions about problems, whose goals and the proper means to achieve them, handles conflicting views about what should be done, and allocates resources. So, injury prevention, as I said, researchers, advocates, and practitioners have made extraordinary progress in identifying the risk factors for injury. We will hear about those findings and present situation. They will present you, and also they have come up with some proposed some interventions to tackle those. So from where you get the evidence for the decision making? It is very important. Evidence to inform decisions about injury-related policies exists. There are enough evidence. However, the problem is that much information is not readily accessible to the policymakers. So that's why we need to educate the policymakers and give them in a way they understand these evidences. We need to package those evidences. So therefore, there are of course many different categories of injury interventions that experts have identified, including efforts to modify behavior, efforts to modify products, the efforts to modify the physical environment or social environment to reduce the risks. In several cases, however, we have been less successful at actually formulating, enacting, implementing, or enforcing some of those interventions. morning, keynote speaker. Talking about prioritization and resource allocation, the issues of prioritization of healthcare services and allocation of resources have recently received increasing attention and discussion, especially with our economic crisis. Priority setting and resource allocation practices constitute processes and rationales applied within healthcare systems. Underfunding of the government health sector is high and widespread and has started to worsen in recent years, with the expenditure relative to the GDP for health dropping to 1.2. So the government spending is about 1.2, 1.3 range for a long time. The burden of underfunding has mainly affected preventive and promotive services and lower-level curative facilities due to the inadequacy of guidelines and standards for prioritization. How has the current expenditure changed over the last several years? In 1990, it has been static. We have been spending only around the public, both the public and private sector has been spending about 3 to 4% of the GDP, and the public sector has been spending about 50%, also about 1.3% to 1.5% of the GDP is spent on the health. That's why even globally explained, Sri Lanka, we are spending little money but achieving greater outcomes with that little money. So imagine if we increase the funding for healthcare. And even spending the money, the allocation in not enough, and then how are we spending that little money, the 1.2%, 1.3% of the GDP, how are we spending? 41% of that goes to care for the patients, inpatient care. Outpatient care takes up about 19% of our budget, and the other pharmaceuticals and treatment and things takes about 19%, and only 5% is spent on preventive health services. Only 5% is spent on preventive health services. So, and even that gets reduced as we go along. Most of the funds are reprogrammed for the preventive services when the contingencies arises. So, for the policymakers to play their role effectively, so that's why let me quote Michael Martin. Why treat people and send them back to the conditions that they made them sick? You are leading the carrying the Commission on Social Determinants of Health. So we need to spend more on prevention and everything. So that is also reflected in that prevention is going upstream. We have been going downstream, spending more and more on preventive care and things. So it's prevention is going upstream. The politicians, the policymakers are very happy to open and construct a new ward, a new hospital, donate an ambulance, but very little emphasis on the preventive work. So, for the policymakers to play their role effectively in addressing the economic burden of injuries and allocating resources for prevention, intervention and rehabilitation, it is essential to consider the multiple factors influencing the policymakers' decisions. What are the factors? These factors, what are the factors that influence the policymakers? You should understand that. These factors include knowing how to communicate, how to new ideas. Providing a source of valid, reliable, and consistent data. Considering the role of patients advocacy groups and non-governmental organizations and presentation of the importance of early intervention in reducing healthcare system costs. Ultimately, the goal is to have a comprehensive, flexible plan for influencing policymakers. So this shows the ways to encourage the policymakers to address the economic burden of these issues. What are the factors influencing policymakers to address the economic burden? Didier Tal presented 10 things. I will list for you to influence policymakers. Firstly, what you want to influence. Secondly, who you want to influence. When you want to influence. Thirdly, working with other people and organizations, which is also very important, which was highlighted this morning too. Policy making is a complex and dynamic and involves many different people and parts. Policymakers' values, experience and expertise play an important role in influencing how they make decisions. Further, it is necessary to focus on clear messages and avoid overly technical language. Policymakers do not need to be told the problem. Rather, they need constructive ideas. Often policymakers, it is a slow process with no obvious impact on the short term. And it is important that we saw in the morning how Singapore has done and brought down all the statistics. Often policymaking is a slow process with no obvious impact on the short term. And it is important to remain flexible and adapt to new contexts and opportunities. I would like to highlight the importance of good governance at this stage. Good and beneficial public policies and decision making remain a sine qua non to good governance in any nation whose government is serious and focused to address and solve the present and emerging problems of society. All actors in the policy process need to be alive to their responsibilities of formulating good, beneficial policies. Formulated policies should be faithfully implemented for the good of the generality of the people in a country. Corruption, which is a cankerworm in the implementation stage, must be confronted head-on. It is generally believed that most of our current policies are good, but implementation is woefully poor because of the hydra-headed problem of corruption. Policy evaluation is also fundamental, as policies need to be reviewed and fine-tuned periodically so as to ensure that they remain relevant and useful in solving the problems for which they were formulated as well as emerging challenges. Let me finish with a couple of quotes. Firstly, Elizabeth Dole says, "The best public policy is made when you are listening to the people who are going to be impacted." Lena S. Wen says, "Public health depends on winning over hearts and minds. It's not enough to just have a good policy. You have convince people actually to follow it. Thank you very much.